Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome back to Speakers Corner, the Al-Emaan Centre's series of Ramadan live talks. We hope that your first week of Ramadan has gone well and you're now finding your fasting feet, inshallah. We have been blessed with some outstanding talent here on Speakers Corner so far, and tonight is no exception. Before we introduce our guest, I'd like to firstly apologise to Imam Abdullah for the technical issues we experienced at the Jummah reminder. Alhamdulillah, these have been resolved. Secondly, we would encourage you all to post any questions on the Q&A or chat functions, which are located on the lower centre of your screen. These will be answered after the talk, and if time permits, we may take one or two live questions as well. We will also be streaming live on YouTube, where a recording will be available in due course. Tonight, our special guest is Dr. Zaza Johnson Elsheikh, who will be talking about the topic, Tying Up Loose Ends, Islam-Compliant Wills. Dr. Zaza is a regular contributor to Al-Emaan Centre through Ihsaan for Women. She is duly qualified as a medical doctor and solicitor, mashallah. Dr. Zaza is a specialist in conflict resolution, as a mediator, an independent investigator for the NHS, and an international commercial arbitrator. She provides Islam-compliant will writing services and is a member of the British Board of Scholars and Imams. So with that said, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Zaza. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Zaza.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for inviting me. Would you like me to proceed?
Absolutely, inshallah.
Okay, khair. Okay, so this evening, inshallah, we'll be talking about wills and as was introduced, tying up loose ends. So many of us fleetingly think about writing a will, and then something else comes up and we defer and we procrastinate about it. And it's also quite uncomfortable to think about us passing and leaving our loved ones behind. But it is an inevitable truth. You may be well today and face illness, and if you're really, really lucky that you don't return to Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala in very sudden circumstances, and that it's you do have the time to prepare through illness or some other circumstance, because I certainly have endured an experience where I was given 2 weeks to live. I signed my consent form for that said that I was understood that I could die. I underwent 6 of those circumstances where I'd signed my life away, so to speak, and I had been previously very, very healthy. So, you know, alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best planner and knows best. And now coming on to why one should write a will. So the circumstances where we are at the moment is that we live in a country that, where English law takes precedence. And so with that being the case, we have the option of writing a will that would be valid under English law and enforceable with no problems whatsoever. But the difficulty, the challenge is that often the situation is that somebody doesn't really know how to write their wills in a way that is compliant with Islam. And so, for instance, if you didn't write a will, the laws of intestacy would apply. And that would mean that your parents wouldn't ordinarily inherit from you if you have children, and your children would all inherit equally. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware that that is not compliant with Islam. And so I was just going to really bring up a few ayahs. I can see that there are more people watching at the moment. So I was just going to bring up a few ayahs with you and hadith, and really ask the question, why should I prepare a will? You know, it's something that I don't really want to think about. It can be done at another time. So I've already covered that all of us will be dha'iqatul al-maut. All of us will taste death, and all of us will return to Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we just don't know when and in what circumstances. So we have in Sahih al-Bukhari in book 51 number 1 that it is the duty of a Muslim who has anything to bequest not to let 2 nights pass without writing a will about it. So in that situation, what this might be referring to is when you buy a property, when you sell a property, but mainly when you acquire something of value. So that could be gold, property, as in a house, shares, anything of financial worth. Then moving to the Quran al-Kareem that we have in Surah Al-Baqarah, ayahs 180 to 182, where Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that it is prescribed for you when death approaches any one of you, if he leaves wealth, that he should make a bequest for the parents and near relatives according to what is acceptable, a duty upon the righteous. So you may have thought initially that, okay, it's a sunnah, should I do it, not do it? Here we have a prescription from Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, a recommendation from Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala that if you leave wealth, then you must or you should make a bequest for your parents and near relatives. And that is a duty upon the righteous. It goes furthermore, Quran al-Kareem goes furthermore into, we're going past Al-Baqarah and into Surah Al-Nisa, and Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala actually gives a warning there and says, firstly gives the limit. So Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that these are limits. So all the prescribed limits, so quarters, sixths, etc. I'll go into that in a little more detail in a moment. That these are all limits set by Allah, and whoever obeys Allah and his messenger will be admitted by him to gardens of paradise, under which rivers will flow, and abiding eternally therein, and that is the great attainment. Then in ayah 14 of Surah An-Nisa, we have the big warning. And whoever disobeys Allah and his messenger and transgresses his limits, he will be put into the fire to abide eternally therein, and he will have a humiliating punishment. So I'm sure none of us want to have a humiliating punishment. It's something that we fear greatly. And so therefore it's about trying to keep to what Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed for us and asked us and ordered us to do. And in that sense, a will, if we don't make a will, let's think about that. If we don't make a will, what would happen? So Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah An-Nisa, in ayah 11, your parents or your children, you know not which of them are nearest to you in benefit. These shares are an obligation imposed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if we were to die intestate, the rules under English law would determine that you would be dying intestate, that you would then, your family would then have to apply for letters of administration to be able to distribute your assets. And when distributing your assets, there are specific rules. So your parents would not inherit and your children would inherit equally, as I mentioned before. So that would be disobeying Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you would leave chaos because your family would be concerned that that's not complying with Islamic law. And so they would be trying to readjust shares, and often as a mediator, I know that there can be a lot of conflict at that time. There's grief and a lot of conflict. So those are the main points that I wanted to make, and really I guess the benefit of this opportunity is to be able to talk through some general examples with you, to point out the disadvantages of not having a will, that you would die intestate. If you are unmarried under English law, in other words, you're married, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen, in Islam, but your marriage is not acknowledged under English law, then there will be further complications if you don't have a will. So for instance, in a scenario where your marriage isn't recognized and there are children and grandchildren, this will mean that your spouse will not inherit, because under English law, it's the spouse who automatically inherits. The spouse would automatically inherit everything, and the children would be treated equally thereafter. And then grandchildren, etc., etc. So the rules are entirely at odds with Islamic law. Just an additional point that within the probate system that you would have to pay £300. So in other words, what would be on offer is that you would have maybe a 9 to 12 month waiting period. The shortest I've ever come across in a case where somebody doesn't have a will and they die intestate has been 7 months of dealing with all the bureaucracy and so on. And I dare say in this time of increased risk, where alhamdulillah rabbil alameen, we have a ta'un that we're living in, a plague that we're living in at the moment. So I dare say that there would be an increased delay as well. And then the legal fees that are associated with that are £300. So what is possible is that if you wanted to think about a will and you wanted me to write your will for you, that you could be in touch. There is a donation associated with that. I don't take any of the money. The money is sent directly to Sudan to benefit the poor there. Those who are encountering coronavirus. Obviously it's Ramadan, alhamdulillah. So really you would be getting, alhamdulillah, your will for a donation in exchange for will. You would be, inshallah, getting many, many rewards. So the money all goes to charity. So that's all I wanted to say. And if there are any questions, I'd be very, very happy to answer.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Zaza. Sorry, we were expecting you to go on perhaps a bit longer, so there may be still people joining or still people trying to sort of formulate answers or sorry, questions in their head. We'll wait for a couple of minutes to see if anything comes through on the chat. So I didn't catch that last bit about the connection with Sudan.
Yes, I was just saying about the donation. So initially I did it for free, and then I thought that it would increase the benefit to the person whose will I'm writing, as well as myself, if I attached a £200 donation, all of which 100% of the donation goes to benefit to those in Sudan who are fasting with coronavirus on the rise. Although it's been quite a challenge here, at least we know that we are at the peak or past the peak, if you believe that. Whereas in Sudan, the increase is exponential currently in terms of coronavirus infection rates, and they don't have the benefit of the NHS. So there's a lot of suffering there. So all the money would be going there, and therefore, bi'iznillahi ta'ala, the reward would be going to whoever asks for their will to be written.
Jazakallah khair for clearing that up. There's a couple of questions on the Q&A. The first one is, how long would it take for you to process the will?
2 days. So that can be, depending on when I get it, it would be 2 working days or just over the weekend. So generally speaking, you know, it can be done quite quickly, and it's immediately valid when it's been witnessed by the person who is writing their will, or I'm writing it on their behalf. And the process is that you sign it and then you get it witnessed. So what I always encourage is witnesses who are independent of the testator or testatrix. So testator is when a man is writing a will, and testatrix is for a woman.
Another question saying, can an email to children be used as a will?
No, is the quick answer to that, because that wouldn't be a legally binding document. It would be evidence of what somebody intended to do, but it wouldn't be a legally binding document. For it to be a legally binding document, it needs to be signed and witnessed. If you wish to sign and witness and get witnessed by independent people and email, the only difficulties with that is that it may fail on clarity. So a couple of, let's say, war stories just since I've been writing wills is ensuring that the names on the will, either for the person who is writing the will, so the testator or the testatrix, or the beneficiaries, to have the names exactly as they appear on your passport. So I've been doing this now, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen, for the past 5 years, and that was in English law as well as Islamic law. So English law much longer, but under Islamic law, to ensure that wills are in accordance with Islamic law. That it can fail, a will can fail for lack of clarity and lack of certainty. So saying, I'm going to give I'd like to give my money to my son, and you give the name of the son, but unfortunately the name's not the same as the name that's on his passport, because you always called him Muji. And so you put Muji on the will, and of course his name isn't Muji, he's got, you know, a full name, and then it becomes about evidence to prove that this is exactly the same person, and so on and so forth. So I would really dissuade you from trying to write your own will unless you're, you know, really thought about it, be very clear about what you want to do, the Islamic side as well, because as Muslims, you're duty bound to divide your assets in that way. You can't say, for instance, oh, you know, I think this is unfair, I want to give my children equally, irrespective of their gender, or I don't want to give my parents. Other questions that have come up. This is why I give a very short talk and then make it more complicated. Something that's come up recently has been that somebody had no speaking contact with their father, and so wished to cut them out of their will. Now, Islamically, that's not possible, it's not acceptable. So really, it's about maintaining that relationship, even if you don't do it in dunya, when you depart, when you return to Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala, that at least that haqq, that right, has been fulfilled.
So there's quite a few more questions coming through, as you probably anticipated.
Yeah.
So the next one is just bring that up, with issues around inheritance tax. Is it possible to structure Islamic wills to minimize such tax liability in a halal way?
So it's definitely possible to do that, and you would need to have a trust set up where the beneficiaries, I have that for my children, and the beneficiaries, you can decide to do it that way, but I'm afraid it's quite difficult to do it in this time. I certainly don't write trust, because you do need to seek advice from a trust lawyer, because each case is very different. It depends what your assets are, and that includes your pension and how you want that to be reflected. But the most important thing, in my view, is that you don't delay, because we do not know when we will be returning to Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala. So my advice to you, as I say, I don't get a penny from this. My advice to you would be to have a will in place, and then when the restrictions have been loosened, lockdowns lifted, and then you can, you know, seek the advice of a trust lawyer, tax lawyer, etc., accountants, if you have business as well. So it can be quite a protracted situation, you know, taking a number of weeks to get the right advice. The general rules on inheritance tax is that you need to survive 7 years after you gift the assets to your beneficiaries. So for instance, if you were to give your house, if you were to put your house, your home into a trust, then it's no longer legally yours. So you wouldn't be able to sell the house yourself because it now belongs to the trust. So you need to think about that when you are putting any assets into a trust. So as I say, it's not something for you to leap at. It's something that you need to seek advice for, but that could take quite some weeks, particularly in this time. So my recommendation, so that you avoid what is frankly extremely chaotic, even in normal times, which is probate, when you don't have a will, your loved ones are not able to go to the bank after your death and just say, look, this is me. Here's my passport. You can see that I am an executor because here is a legally binding document, namely the will, which names me as the executor with one other. Very clearly, our names match, our dates of birth match. This is definitely me. Could we please have that money distributed, those assets distributed, you know, that sort of thing. It's much, much easier. It's not that they're just going to hand everything to you at that moment, but it's much, much easier when you have a will.
Exactly. Next question. If your affairs are simple, would an online Islamic will template suffice?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yes, yes. And there are various organizations who provide the service. I would just say that, you know, if you say if your affairs are simple, then, you know, I would just want you to be clear what simple means. So I'll just check in with you that one of the elements that you need to check on if you're doing an online template, for instance, is, have you named guardians for your children? So any children under the age of 18, and in our cultures, many of our cultures, we don't consider our children to be adults and independent when they're over 18, that we would want them to have a wali amr for various decisions, university, marriage, etc., etc. So it's very important that you don't just leave it in that default where, you know, an uncle and an elder brother, a grandfather just, you know, takes the helm and makes all the decisions about your child. If you know, you actually had somebody who you would have preferred, that you could have named, and it could have been a legally binding appointment, because once they're in this legally binding document with their name, address, date of birth, it's much easier, again, rather than social services seeing where your children would live, in the event that both you and your partner, you know, both parents, in other words, were to return to Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Exactly. The next question, should the witness be a Muslim?
No, they don't need to be a Muslim.
That's fine. And growing up, our elders had wills.
The beneficiaries have to be Muslim unless it's in the discretionary 33.33%. But so there's a discretionary component of the will of your estate under Islam, that you're able to give 33.33%, in other words, a third, to anybody who doesn't have a haqq over you. So that could be the cat and dogs home, it could be a charity, a Muslim charity, anybody, anything. It could be somebody, a cousin, a niece who didn't have a haqq over you, that you could give them.
Sorry to interrupt there. So the next question is, growing up, our elders had wills and these were filled with guidance and prayer. Following this, the will requested adherence to Islamic ruling in the Quran. Is this allowed under British law, or could this be thrown out in British courts?
Sorry, let me just read that again.
Yeah, sure.
Growing up, our elders had wills and these were filled with guidance and prayer. Following this, the will requested adherence to Islamic ruling in the Quran. Is this allowed under British law, or could this be thrown out in British courts? So it's not the Islamic nature of it, it's whether it had certainty. So within the English law system, there's a letter of wishes. So the letter of wishes would have all those aspects of who you wanted to be at your ghusl, who, this cousin, distant cousins, that you wanted them to have your favorite saris, clothing, etc., etc. All of that doesn't go in the will. And the reason it doesn't go in the will, or I don't put it in the will, let's put it that way, my practice is to keep all these sort of extras, personal effects, etc., all in a letter of wishes. Whereas the will is, generally speaking, the most that it would go to is your gold. If you're a woman, your gold. Otherwise, it's sort of fixed assets such as shares and bank accounts, so all the details of the bank account. So I wouldn't be able to tell you whether your parents' wills or elders' wills are valid unless I looked at them. So it's impossible for me to give you a definitive of that, but I would just give you a word of caution that please make sure that all names that are listed in the will, if they are listed in the will rather than just my children, my grandchildren, that all the names exactly match their passports or driving licenses. Dates of birth are included, as well as addresses, because of course addresses can change over time, because you're writing a will today, maybe nobody will need to look at that will for another 40 years. Only Allah knows when we will return, in which case people's addresses may have changed, but their date of birth never changes. Even if their passport name changes in 40 years' time through marriage or anything else, their date of birth, inshallah, will always remain the same. So please be very careful to ensure that it's done properly, so that even it's not just about being thrown out of a British court, it's the hassle of proving that this person is who they say they are, and in terms of being a beneficiary of the deceased, the person who's died their will.
One more on the list there. So where do you keep a will to ensure it will be actioned after you pass? Is there a central repository somewhere?
Yes, so you keep your will at home. You tell the people who your executors, because I wouldn't recommend you to name people as your executors or guardians for your children without seeking their consent. Because it's not a great, firstly, obviously, that they would be looking at the will or considering the will after you've returned to Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala, so they may be sad to hear that you've departed, but also then they're faced with having to take in 4 children in their 3-bedroom house because you have named them guardian, just thinking that it wouldn't actually ever transpire. You'd never actually have to ask this person to look after your children for the rest of their time till they reach adulthood. So you must always ask your executors, because they are the ones who will be taking the responsibility to do the running around to banks, to land registry, etc., etc., etc. So all the sort of legal stuff. And they would be responsible for liaising. They're the ones who would decide whether to sell your assets, keep hold of your assets, etc., etc. So they need to be people that you trust. And therefore, I would suggest that even if you don't want to give them your will, that you tell them where your will is kept. That's for the executors. And the guardians, that you just tell them, you ask them first if it's okay to name them as the guardian and what it would entail. Is it all your children, some of your children, if you were to return to Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala soon? And in terms of the central repository, I recommend to everybody to please not to just rely on putting your wills, depositing your wills with a solicitor or somebody else. as well as your own home, because we are in uncertain times in any event, but also just in case, you know, there's a flood in your home, or there'll be a fire in your home, and the will is destroyed, that it is the very best. It's £30 only. I highly recommend that you register your will with the National Will Registry. So that is in the cloud. And it's £30, and it will be there forever, and the government is able to see your will. It doesn't have any money in it. So I hasten to add that the way that Muslims write their wills, recommended to write their wills, is that there are only percentages. So there's no actual figures other than percentages. So the percentages are fixed, of course, for those who inherit in a fixed way, such as parents and spouses. It can vary depending on the circumstances, if they've got children or not, and then the children, obviously their percentages vary. But the most important thing is that what has happened in my practice in the last 4 years, because I've been doing it for longer than that, but since 4 years ago, English, so not Muslim at all, English clients have asked me to prepare their wills with percentages, because they realize that sometimes they've got, you know, big ideas of leaving 10,000 to Amanda, for instance, and 2,000 to Jake, and so on and so forth. And then by the time they're actually dying, that they've lost that money. And so it's better to have it as percentages. So whilst they're not Muslim, and whilst they don't have it in the fixed shares that we do, they've actually started to use percentages. So whatever's left, there will be this percentage to go to Amanda, and this percentage to go to Jake.
Jazakallah khair. There's a question: if you have assets but don't have a will, is this a sin?
Is this a sin?
Yes.
Well, I mean, if you like, I can bring up for the ayahs. That's very quick to do, and it, you know, it's very clear that Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to prepare. So I'll just bring it down to yeah. So Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us to prepare a will. So you can see the ayah in English and Arabic here. 180 of Al-Baqarah, and you can read it at your own leisure as well. But Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala describes this as a duty upon the righteous. So that's, you know, you can think of it as an option, sunnah to do it, but the difficulty lies in what I was saying earlier, that in 413, that Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that there are limits set by Allah, and whoever obeys Allah and His Messenger will be admitted to Jannah, inshallah, and those who do not will not, under 414, so ayah 14. You can see, and whoever disobeys. So I would suggest, to be on the very safest side, that you should write a will if you've got any assets, because Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you that that's prescribed for you when death approaches one of you.
Jazakallah khair. There's a couple of questions from YouTube, actually. Can an Islamic framed will be contested by a family member under English law?
Oh yes, yes, it can be contested, but as long as it is legally binding, because under English law, you are allowed to write your will in whatever way you like. So if you decided as a British citizen, if you decided to give 100% of your assets to the cat and dog home, you could do that, as long as there's no evidence that you are of unsound mind. You can definitely do that. Within Islam, you cannot. So you're not allowed to do that. So assuming that everyone listening is Muslim, this is quite important, that you write a will and that you write it in accordance with Islamic law, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. Could you share some information on the different types of wills legally? For example, would you recommend a trust be made when formulating a will? I think you touched upon this earlier,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. So it's definitely a possibility to create a trust, but because of the time that it takes and the advice that you need, so I would definitely recommend a trust lawyer, potentially an accountant as well, seeking their advice, because one of the difficulties of having a trust is that if, for instance, you sought to avoid inheritance tax by ensuring that you put all your assets into this trust, you would need to survive 7 years from the date of the creation of the trust for it to be exempt from inheritance tax. So it's not a magic wand. You have to survive 7 years. Allahu A'lam whether you survive or not. And the other issue is that it means that you cannot dispose of your assets, because they're no longer your assets, they're the trust's assets. Yeah. So you could live in the property, but you couldn't sell the property whilst it's in a trust. Yeah, it defeats the objective of it, because the reason that it defeats inheritance tax is that you're saying it's no longer your asset, it's the family's asset, your children's asset.
I think that's similar to the next question, but next question is, can I have a home mortgage which isn't fully paid in my will?
So your mortgage would be absolutely part of your, so let's say you have a home with a mortgage on it. I'm not sure whether this is your main residence or buy to let or an investment, but all you would be doing in your will is that you would be listing all your assets. So that could be a property that you're interest-free, paying interest-free mortgage on it, or it could be an interest-only mortgage. You know, that's the whole spectrum, you know, an interest-free all the way to interest-only. So in that scenario, as long as you have ownership of this property, so as long as it is listed on the land registry in the UK, you would include it in your will. It doesn't matter that it's got a mortgage or not. On your return to Rabbana Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, the bank will clearly be presented your death certificate by your executor who's named in your will, and they will be able to take what they need to take, or their rules of survivorship would apply. And again, rules of survivorship are a tricky area, because under English law, for instance, myself, my husband and I own our house jointly. In the event of my return to Rabbana Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, that my husband, because we have children, that my husband would have a haqq, would have a right to 25% of all of my assets. And so therefore, you know, he would have received 100% of the property because of the English laws of survivorship. But he would know, and everybody would know, including our children, that dad will only be having 25% of mum's assets because they have X other assets and Y other assets, the children, that my father would know that, you know, he is going to be getting 16.66%. My mother would know that she would be getting 16.66% of all my assets. And of course, my house would be included in the assets. So it's really a way of bringing clarity to something which can be, people are grief-stricken, all sorts of old resentments can come up at that time. It's a way of providing certainty and quickly, rather than waiting for, you know, up to a year plus through probate.
Jazakallah khair. And the final question, actually, I would say, because it would wrap things up nicely, this is coming from quite a few participants, including myself, is how do we contact you to write a will?
Okay, so I'll put my email on the chat, and inshallah, so I'll just put that to the panelists, or did you want me to put it to everyone?
I think to everyone would be.
Panelists and attendees?
Panelists and attendees would be great,
yeah.
inshallah.
Okay, fine. So yes, I'll put it down, and then that way, inshallah, you can contact me. That just to make absolutely clear that your information will not be shared with anybody else, that it will only be me and you, and that after the will is written, if you'd like me to do that, that we have a Zoom call similar to this, but only me and you. If it's a husband and wife and you agree to do it together, then it can be the two of you, not the will together, but to have the call together, because just like we are accountable to Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala as individuals, not for each other, and also that our passports are only for us, so we don't have one passport for husband and wife. You need to have separate wills because they're legally binding document. And in that scenario, what happens is that we go through all your questions, any further questions, but I just ask for your information first. And I write your will, and then we have the appointment via Zoom where you can ask questions like you are now. Okay.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Zaza. I think we're pretty much out of time now, but Jazakallah khair for your incredibly thorough and detailed analysis of a lot of the factors involved with wills, and it's clear that it's kind of incumbent on us to do this as soon as possible. So could I ask you, Dr. Zaza, to finish with a short dua, and then we can close the meeting, inshallah.
May Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala bless us with the knowledge, all the knowledge that will benefit us, and keep away from us all the knowledge that will not benefit us, and give us the means in which to please Rabbana subhanahu wa ta'ala in Ramadan and beyond Ramadan, and to heighten our rank in paradise, inshallah Rabbil Alameen. Ameen.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Zaza. For those of you who are keen to stay on for Sheikh Mudaffar Nouri's recitation, please do stay on the line. But from Dr. Zaza, that's all for this evening. Jazakallah khair again, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much indeed. I hope that's been of benefit. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum.